Hi there, and welcome to Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we are going to talk about verbal communication. In particular, we are going to try and understand language and meaning, as well as offer some guidelines for effective communication. Some key words and terms that we're going to be dealing with are symbols, of course, nonverbal communication, verbal communication, arbitrary, ambiguous, abstract, brute facts, institutional facts, communication rules, regulative rules, constitutive rules, punctuation, totalizing, loaded language, as well as hypothetical thought. Also, make sure you stay tuned towards the end for Ask Dr. Shepard. This week, I take on an Ask Dr. Shepard from a listener who feels as if their friend group is not including them. All right, let's delve into today's lecture on verbal communication. So when we think about verbal communication, aka is language. It consists of symbols in forms of spoken or written word. And so language consists of symbols which are representations of people, events, and all that goes on around us. So just a reminder, in the previous podcast episode, we talked about nonverbal communication, which includes symbols that aren't words, such as facial expressions, postures, tone of voice. So verbal communication is strictly the words. How the words are said is nonverbal, but the actual words themselves is what we focus on when it comes to verbal communication. And when it comes to interpretation of verbal communication, understanding the actual language, it's important to highlight how words are arbitrary, they're abstract, and they're ambiguous. So words being arbitrary means that verbal symbols, aka words, are not intrinsically connected to what they represent. So words seem right because we as a society have agreed upon their usage. For example, the word blue we know refers to a certain color, but in an alternate universe, the word blue might mean what we come to understand as the word pink. It's just that we have decided that the word blue means this color and the word pink means another color. We know that words are abstractions in terms of that words are not connected to any tangible phenomena. So they stand in for ideas, for people, events, objects, and feelings. And so because language is abstract, there's potential for confusion mushrooms. But we can minimize misunderstandings by using specific language instead of abstract terms. And of course, language and words are always ambiguous, which means that they don't have a clear-cut, precise meaning. Meaning of words can vary due to cultural context, individual experiences, and this can also lead to misunderstanding. So the best way to engage with words and concepts, if we are aware that they're arbitrary, they're abstract, and they're ambiguous, especially in our interpersonal communication, is provide examples. So a perfect example of an easy way for miscommunication to appear in interpersonal communication is just the concept of love. If I say, I love you, what exactly does that mean? For different people, it means different things. We can think of love through the different love languages. We can think of love through a host of different lenses and contexts, but you have to define what that means. So for me, I always think about if someone says, you don't love me. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that they're not showing you love in the way that you would like love to be shown? So if you're trying to be more ethical and effective with your communication, and maybe you're having a disagreement or argument with someone, maybe a potential romantic partner, you might talk about, I don't feel loved because you don't do X, Y, and Z. And for me, love is defined by doing X, Y, and Z. That then shifts the conversation instead of the person potentially feeling as if you're attacking them and saying, you don't love me. If someone says that to you and you love them, you care about them deeply, you're going to become defensive. Like, what do you mean? I love you. I do all these things for you. But if the accusation of you don't love me is then provided with context about how you view love, how you understand love, that then maybe allows the person you're communicating with to engage in kind and respond to those accusations with more concrete detail. So it's always going to be important to use specific language, use specific examples to underscore these arbitrary, these abstract, and these ambiguous concepts. So when it comes to interpreting, right, we create our own meanings. So interpretation is an active, creative process that we use to make sense of our experiences. And it's going to be important to distinguish between what we call brute facts versus institutional facts. So brute facts are objective, they're concrete phenomena, and they're activities. So I was watching a football game the other day, and a brute fact is that people in football games cluster together. That's just a fact that happens on the field. So the institutional fact would be the meanings of the brute fact based on our human interpretations. So we would name that a huddle, and the institutional fact is that players are planning the next play. So oftentimes what happens is we misinterpret brute facts and institutional facts, right? Brute facts are objective, they're concrete phenomena and activities. And institutional facts are our meanings based on that brute fact that we have interpreted. And so sometimes we haven't even agreed upon the brute fact, so there's no way we're going to agree upon the institutional meaning. And this is where we see miscommunication. Also, when it comes to communication, especially interpersonal communication, we're going to have those communication rules. So these are hopefully shared understandings among members of a particular culture or social group about what communication means and what behaviors are appropriate as well as inappropriate. So if we think about in the interpersonal communication context with friends, we have rules. And oftentimes those rules are based somewhat in juvenile understandings of friendship. And it's going to be important as we mature and as we grow with our friendships that we figure out what rules work for us and what rules don't. So perfect communication kind of rule, right, that I have experienced with friends that differ is one of my friends. She believes that if she has a falling out with a friend that she introduced me to, that I no longer am able to be friends with them. That is a shared understanding that we have. And we've explicitly talked about that, where if a good friend of hers and she have fallen out, then I can't reach out. I can't engage with that person as I would before because she is our connector. Meanwhile, for me, if I have a falling out or an issue with somebody, I don't have that same rule, even for that friend. And we've talked about that because there are people in my life who I currently do not associate with, but my friend does. And she's always stressed, if you just say the word, I will cut them off. I will let them know that, hey, I know that you and Marcus aren't on great terms right now. So I think it's inappropriate for you to reach out knowing that I am one of his best friends, AKA his sister. So we know that these are helping us understand what communication means and what behavior is appropriate and inappropriate. So clearly in this term of, to be friends with someone or not to be friends with someone, if your friend fell out with them, that's a communication rule. That might be a regulative rule or a constitutive rule, right? And I'll break down those and then we can see which one it probably fits best with. So a regulative rule regulates interpretations by specifying when, how, where, and with whom to communicate certain things with. And a constitutive rule defines what a particular communication means or stands for. So my best friend's rule of if I have a falling out with someone, you can't be friends with them anymore, that would be a regulative rule. It's saying when, how, where, and with whom I can communicate about certain things. Or on the flip side, who I can't communicate about certain things with. A constitutive rule, as we said before, defines what a particular communication means or stands for. So constitutive rules, we learn that most people regard specific kinds of communication as showing respect, such as attentively listening, not correcting, and rudeness, talking over others. That's a constitutive rule. If I talk over you, it means maybe I don't respect you, or maybe I'm not paying attention, or maybe I think my point is more important. And we know that rules guide our everyday interactions by telling us when to communicate, what to communicate, how to interpret others' verbal as well as nonverbal communications. So few rules are rigidly fixed. Just like communication itself, most rules are subject to change. And for the most part, we're really not conscious of the rules that guide how, when, where, and with whom we communicate about various things, aka those regulative rules. We are indoctrinated into them based on mediated examples, based on our upbringing. Our caretakers oftentimes will impart these rules to us, and we also establish these rules through life. So maybe what worked with one friend or what didn't work with another friend, you'll apply to another friend and see if that works. Or what worked in one dating relationship situation or didn't work, you may or may not apply to the next one. So it's important that we understand that communication rules clearly help us figure out what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and what I've seen, especially teaching interpersonal communication for almost a decade now, is a lot of times we don't explicitly spell these rules out. And the only time we figure out these rules is when there's a transgression, when someone does something that you don't appreciate, that you assume you have the same meaning. And as we've talked about before on this podcast, when we assume, you sometimes make a out of yourself, right? So we want to make sure, especially as we all try and be more ethical and effective with our interpersonal communication, that we spell out these regulative rules, that we spell out these constitutive rules. So I've talked about before how me and Kiara, sometimes when we get into heated discussions, we interrupt people, right? So that would be interrupt one another, talking over each other, right? The constitutive rule might say that that's rude. And so we've gotten to a point where we've realized that, hey, I'm going to let you speak. I'm going to let you say what you need to say. And then I'm going to say what I need to say. And so we've respected that rule. We've created that rule. But sometimes we're human. We interrupt each other still. And I know sometimes I'll be like, hey, I've let you say your piece. Remember, please let me finish my point. And then you can address it. And anytime I say that or she says something similar, the other person respects it. And we're mindful of that. So it's obvious that most of us don't spell out these communication rules when it comes to our verbal communication, but it's going to be especially important. And when you do that, it helps alleviate potential issues, potential assumptions that we assume we have the same rules, because oftentimes we don't. And so someone may be transgressing a rule that they didn't actually agree to. So we need to be mindful of that. And when it comes to verbal communication, we also have this concept of punctuation. So punctuation in verbal communication is a way to mark a flow of activity into meaningful units. Punctuation is our perception of when an interaction begins and ends. And what's fascinating with punctuation, especially in this digital age, is sometimes it becomes hard to figure out when something began and when something ends. So when people don't agree upon the punctuation, they don't share meaning for what is happening between them. And a perfect example of this that we're all probably aware of and have all probably done when we were younger is if you've ever heard children arguing about who started a fight, you understand the importance of punctuation, because it's like, well, this person did this. Well, no, this person did this. Well, no, they did this before, right? And they're not agreeing upon when the communication event verbally began and when it ended. And as I alluded to a few moments ago, with social media, it's become a lot harder because oftentimes with communication, we are communicating with people across different spectrums. And when I say that, I might be texting you at the same time I'm DMing you, at the same time we're on FaceTime or on the phone or in person. I'm face to face with someone, but I'm also engaging with other people. So when is my punctuation beginning? When is it ending with these different people? And that, of course, makes it hard in this era of interpersonal communication. I oftentimes think about the era before the internet, and communication was kind of very obvious when it began and ended. We saw each other in person. Okay, now we haven't seen each other. It's ended. Or we talked on the phone. Now the phone call's over. It's ended. But because of these phones that we are all tethered to, when does it end? When does it begin? Emails, texts, social media DMs or comments or tweets or TikToks, phone calls, FaceTimes. We're all inundated. So when did it begin? When did it end? Just because you texted someone, if they didn't respond, well, were they asleep? Were they doing something? So punctuation has become a lot harder to identify with verbal communication. And with that said, we know that language creates meaning. So language helps us define phenomena. It also helps us evaluate phenomena. It helps us organize experiences. And it also allows us to have hypothetical thought as well as self-reflection, and helps us define what relationships and interactions look like. So we know that language defines phenomena, and we have a concept called totalizing, where we respond to a person as if one label totally represents that person. And clearly, we want to hopefully avoid totalizing, because when you totalize someone, you're missing out on the whole of them. So I oftentimes talk to my students about how, yes, I am your professor, and yes, you are my student, but I'm not just going to view you as that one label. And so how I craft my courses, I'm aware that you're just not my student, but you're a student in other courses. I'm also aware that you might have some familial obligations, some friend obligations, maybe romantic obligations. You might have a job. So if I chose to just totalize you and view you as my student, how I would approach and engage you will be different than if I view you more as a whole individual that exists with multiple hats. We also know that language evaluates phenomena, so language is not neutral. It's laden with values. So loaded language, right? Words that slant perceptions and thus meaning. So words are oftentimes valenced as negative or positive. So I think of, if I'm referring to someone who's older, if I call them an elder, that's more of a positive loaded term. If I call them a geezer, that's probably a negative valence term. And we can think about describing people, and these different descriptive words are all labeled and loaded either positively or negatively. And we know that the more you use labels that are loaded negatively, the more negative you're going to view that person and that communication event or experience, versus the more times you use a positive language to describe someone. So if I say that someone is caring because they're always checking in on me, that's positive. I'm going to view that relationship more so as a positive experience, versus if I say that they're overbearing. That's more negative. That, oh, they're always checking on me. They're so overbearing. Okay. And if I keep using more negative language, I'm going to have more of a negative view of that interpersonal relationship. As I said, also, we know language organizes experiences. So words organize our perceptions of events and experiences. And then we know language also allows for hypothetical thought. So hypothetical thought, which is essentially thinking about experiences and ideas that are not part of our concrete daily reality. So hypothetical thoughts are plans, dreams, setting goals, considering alternative actions, imagining possibilities. Language allows us to name and imagine these possibilities beyond what currently exists. And hypothetical thought is possible because we're symbol users. So words give form to ideas so that we can hold them in our minds and reflect on them. So hypothetical thought can help us improve who we are. It can enrich our own personal relationships by allowing us to remember shared moments. And this is oftentimes when I talk about losing relationships, one of the things that impacts people the most when you lose a relationship is the fact that you don't have that person to share that memory with anymore, those moments. So I know One of my best friends, Darius, and I were famous for having multi-hour conversations anytime we get off the phone. And usually one of us has to just pry the other off the phone, like, okay, I'm about to eat, or I'm going out now. Like, you've been on the phone with me while I've been taking a shower, while I've been doing all these things, right? Okay, I gotta go. And a lot of our conversations are shared meanings, right? We rehash old stories, we retell stories for the umpteenth time. And so one of the hardships of losing any type of interpersonal relationship is you don't have that person to have those kind of hypothetical thoughts with anymore. And that leads to us understanding that language allows for self-reflection, so we can think about how we want to be and set goals for becoming the self that we desire. And language helps us do that. And language, lastly, helps us define relationships and interactions. So responsiveness. Through questions and statements of agreement or disagreement, we show our interest in other communication. Liking. We express liking verbally. I like you. I find you attractive. You're a great time. You're good company. These are statements that show that you like someone. Or on the flip side, if you don't like someone, you're kind of boring, disinteresting, don't have much going on for yourself, annoying, right? These words allow us to display if we like someone or not. And power, right? We use verbal communication to define dominance and to negotiate status and influence. We see this a lot in interpersonal relationships, especially in the co-working space, where bosses will use certain types of language to define their power over you. And so that then brings us to the last part of our podcast episode about some guidelines for effective verbal communication. So we first and foremost want to engage in person-centered communication. We've talked about this concept before, but just a refresher, person-centeredness is when we perceive distinctions between people, so we can adapt our communication to particular individuals. Person-centeredness is linked to cognitive complexity. People who are cognitively complex are able to perceive others and situations, usually in more comprehensive and integrated ways than are less cognitively complex people. So engaging in person-centeredness, as I said before, I don't totalicize my students, right? If you totalicize people viewing them as one label, you're not using person-centeredness. I use person-centeredness in my classroom and as I approach and engage with people where they are not one thing. They're a multitude of ideas and sometimes walking contradictions. And so to be aware of that, you can usually have better communication events, better interpersonal interactions with these people. We also want to be aware of levels of abstraction, so we can reduce the likelihood of misunderstanding by being conscious of levels of abstraction. So abstract language is not always inadvisable. The goal, though, is to use a level of abstraction that suits particular communication objectives and situations. So abstract words are appropriate when speakers and listeners have similar knowledge about what is being discussed. I don't have to give you such minute details and examples. But usually when you are getting to know someone, when you are fostering that interpersonal communication, when you don't have that established base and wealth of knowledge and understanding, you're going to want to avoid abstract language. And you're going to want to use, hopefully, qualifying language. So qualifying language, you usually qualify generalizations so that we don't mislead others into mistaking a general statement for an absolute one. We should qualify language when describing and evaluating people. And so one way to do this, of course, is indexing. So this is a technique to remind us that our evaluations apply to specific times and circumstances, and that this doesn't represent someone as an absolute. So this person is lazy. Well, maybe they were just having a restful day. We can even see lazy usually as a negative valence word. And I've tried to remove that from my lexicon. And when I'm quote unquote being lazy, I view it as being restful, being mindful, doing self-care, not overly exerting myself. So we want to be mindful, right, of those levels of abstraction and using that qualifying language. And lastly, and we've talked about this before, but it's really important to do when it comes to verbal communication, is owning our own feelings and thoughts. So you want to take responsibility for your feelings and rely on I language and not you language. So first, I statements own responsibility. And second, they're more descriptive than you statements. So it's going to feel awkward usually at first saying, I feel this way when you do da da da, or I think this because you do da 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 da. But then it's more descriptive. It's not abstract. And it allows the person to respond directly. So going back to the I don't feel loved, if you phrase it as you don't love me, period, it's abstract. What is the person exactly responding to? But if you say, I don't feel loved because when we get together and have movie nights, you're oftentimes on your phone and disconnected. Perfect example. Now you're allowing the person, it's descriptive. Here's a specific aspect of a moment when I don't feel loved because I think our movie nights are quality time and you're not really spending quality time with me if you're scrolling on social media, if you're texting other people, if you're responding to your direct messages. So that is looking at verbal communication in a nutshell when it comes to our interpersonal relationships. Clearly, as I stated towards the beginning, verbal communication consists of the symbols, aka language, in the forms of spoken and or written words. And then nonverbal communication is everything else, as we discussed on a previous podcast episode. So that now brings us to Ask Dr. Shepard for this week. The Ask Dr. Shepard was very detailed, and I don't necessarily think it's probably smart for me to read it in its entirety. So I kind of just blurbed a quick little byline of what it was. But if you ever want to send an Ask Dr. Shepard to get my opinion, my thoughts, my educated guess on what you should do with your own interpersonal issues, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So with this Ask Dr. Shepard, as I previewed in the introduction, is around a friend who's feeling a little left out in their friend group. The essence of the message was essentially they have not been invited to a lot of things recently that the group of friends has been doing. The person has found out about them on social media because people are posting pictures and they're starting to feel left out because of it. And they're asking what they should do. They feel nervous about confronting them because in the past they've confronted when something similar has happened and it kind of blew up and backfired, but they want to know what they should do. So after reading all the data and details that they provided, right off the data provided, I do think it's actually important to confront a friend or two in the group and just try and figure out what's going on. I would just recommend doing it one-on-one, face-to-face, and just saying how you feel. Using that I language. I feel left out because I'm seeing on social media that a lot of you are hanging out and I'm not invited. And so I want to know what's going on with that. It might be a very plausible explanation. It also might not be. But I think you need to put yourself out there, especially if these are your friends, that they are going to be open and honest with you about why they haven't chosen to invite you to these different events. So I know, for instance, I do a lot of inviting in my local friend group here in Philly, but other people also do invites, and sometimes I've declined, sometimes they've declined, sometimes I haven't been invited to certain things, sometimes they haven't been invited to certain things. But when I haven't been invited, it's oftentimes very obvious because I take COVID very seriously. And so if it's an event that is going to maybe not be so COVID cautious, they're mindful of that and they're aware. And so they're not going to offer me an invite that they know I'm going to turn down. So I know, for instance, for me, I don't take it as an offense at all because they're being very mindful of my COVID guidelines, right? But I can see if you're not a person that's observing strong COVID guidelines that it might hurt, or you might be trying to figure out what it is. And so I know, especially in this economic climate, I know speaking with different people, sometimes they don't invite people because they're aware that maybe money is tight for this person. They don't want to push them out of their financial situation. But I would say if we're close friends, that's a conversation you can have with the person before you host the thing. Hey, I'm going to have this thing. I know you're going through some financial hardship, so maybe you won't be able to afford a X amount for a bottomless brunch, or we're going out to this fancy restaurant. And so I didn't want to tax you with you trying to clearly come with us, but also not knowing you can afford it. So I think also the onus can be put a little bit on the friend as well, if that's their reason. But we honestly don't know what their reason is. So I would say confront a friend or two in the group, but do it in an open way. Just do it in the fact that I feel hurt. I feel as if I'm drifting apart from the friend group, and I want to figure out how I can re-engage. And maybe it also is, are you not inviting them anytime to do anything? Are you just relying on this person to always invite, to always foster and create this opportunity for fellowship? And if you take a step back and self-reflect and figure out, hey, have I actually not invited these people out to do something and I'm relying on them, then maybe it's time for you to host something or to plan something. And that can also be a way to reinvigorate or reactivate you into the friend group, because clearly you are part of it. You're just feeling as if they're drifting apart a bit. So I hope that helps to you. Hopefully you understand that this is for you. I will send you a little email to tell you that I talked about it abstractly. And as I always say, if you do want my opinion, my thoughts, my Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. With that said, I will see you all on the next one.